Okay, good evening. Welcome to Parsha Share, Parsha's Savo. Three very interesting ideas to share this evening. The Parsha begins with, of course, the mitzvah of Bikurim, the very powerful celebration of bringing the first crops to the Beis Hamikdash, and then the Parsha continues, and you have the whole episode of Har Evel and Har Grizim, where, as we discussed in the Halacha Share, you have 6 Shvatim on one mountain, 6 Shvatim on the other mountain, and the Kohanim and Levim in the middle saying over the klalas and the brachas, and the people responding Amen. And then you have the Teichacha, the second Teichacha in the Torah, the first, of course, in Parshas Bechukosai, and the second in this week's Seder in Parshas Savo. So let's begin with a very beautiful idea I saw in Rabbi Bernstein's Sefer, Rabbi Emmanuel Bernstein's Sefer. I thought it would be appropriate to mention it because it's he's quoting his father, Rabbi Isaac Bernstein, whose 30th Yahrzeit is next week, astonishing, 30 years. So I'll share with you one idea he says in the name of his father, a very beautiful idea. Take a look at the first box. If you're listening online, please email me at j.golker@gmail.com and I'll send you the handout. The Parsha says in the beginning there in the top box, you take the first of the fruit, of the land that Hashem gave you, you take it to the Kohen, and you say the whole Parsha. Higadati Hayoim L'Hashem Elokecha Ki Basi L'Haaretz Asher Nishba Hashem Lo V'Seinu Lo Seslanu. I've come to the land which HaKadosh Baruch Hu gave us. V'lokach HaKohen Hatenem Yodecha. The Kohen takes the basket. V'yinichu L'fnei Mizbeach Hashem Elokecha. V'oniso v'amartz L'fnei Hashem Elokecha. Rami Ovid Avi V'yered Mitzrayim. So he says the whole parsha. Now, there are two very interesting mishnayos in Maseches Bikurim, which of course is dedicated to the whole parsha, the whole story, the whole episode of Bikurim. Says the Mishnah in Bikurim, Perek Gimel Mishnah Zayin, B'Rishayna, originally, Kol mi sheyedea lekros, whichever farmer who was bringing his produce was able to read, Kaira, he would read the Parsha. V'chol mi she'ein yodea lekros, but anyone who was unable to read, Makrin oisai, then we get somebody to read for him. We get the Kohen to stand up and we read on his behalf. Now, that was embarrassing, because somebody who couldn't read, you had to get somebody to read for you. So nimnu milahavi, people refrained from bringing because it was a little bit awkward, a little bit embarrassing. So therefore they made a takona. Hiskinu shu makrin es misha yedea ves misha ein yedea. They made a takona that they read the parsha for everybody. You can have the greatest Talmud Chacham, someone who can read very well. I remember one time I met an old man when I was in yeshiva, and he asked me how I was learning, and he asked me who my Rabbi was. So I told him, and he said, "Your Rabbi," he said, "I taught him Aleph Beis." So I remember I said to him, I said, "You should be pleased to know he knows it really well." But you could be a Talmud Chacham, and you know how to read very well, but after the takon, you have someone, Kohen would recite the words regardless of whether they could read. Why? So as not to shame those who could not read. And yet, in the very next Mishnah, in Perek Gimel Mishnah Ches, the Mishnah says, "Ha'ashirim meviim bikureihem beklosas shel kesef v'shel zohov." They would bring their bikurim in baskets of silver and of gold. V'ha'aniyim meviim oisom b'salin netzarim shel arei v'klufa. They would bring it in sort of straw baskets. V'habikurim nitnem lekohen, and then the bikurim would be given to the kohanim. So you've got also a situation where people could be embarrassed. You can't come along with a very fancy basket of bikurim in a silver tray, but rather you come along in your straw basket. Why weren't Chazal also protective of the honor of the poor person? Why didn't they also enact that everyone should bring their bikurim in straw baskets? Just like they enacted that someone is going to be makri, the Kohen has got to recite the words for everybody so as not to embarrass those who couldn't read. So too, everyone should bring in straw baskets so as not to embarrass those who can't afford a fancier basket. So Isaac Bernstein said the following idea, really a magnificent idea. The first enactment achieved two things. Number one, it clearly spared the shame of those who couldn't read, because somebody's going to read for everybody, regardless of whether you can read or you can't read, and therefore it spares my shame. But on the other hand, the second outcome of this enactment was that it let people know that not being able to read is worth being ashamed about. And therefore, I can understand you're ashamed, and we've got to have an enactment to deal with it, but this is a cause for, I recognize your embarrassment, and not being able to read is worth being ashamed about. Why? So what about the next takana? Why didn't they make a takana for the poor people? The answer is, not having money is nothing to be ashamed about. That's life. It's a galgal hachayzer. There are some people who are wealthy, there are some people who are not wealthy, but not having the bracha of money is not something to be embarrassed about. Not being able to read, that's worth being embarrassed about. That's worth being ashamed. And sometimes the reality is exactly the opposite. People strive for financial independence, rightly so. But do they also strive with the same vigor for intellectual independence? Do they also strive that they can read the Gemara unaided without the crutch, if you like, of an art scroll or whatever it may be? And really what this enactment is telling us, that not being able to read, being illiterate, is worth being ashamed about. So it's a very interesting insight of Rabbi Isaac Bernstein. Okay, let's move on. Interesting Rashi, which I saw dealt with in the Sefer of Rabbi Yaakov Bender. He was in London this week. He was at the Mir dinner last night. He was the guest speaker. And he says an amazing pshat on a Rashi in this week's Parsha. Take a look at box number 2. Vayikra Moshe b'nei Yisrael, Kol Yisrael, Vayom aleihem, atem re'isim es kol asher osa Hashem le'neichem be'eretz Mitzrayim lefar l'chol avodah v'l'chol haaretz. You saw with your own eyes, hamasas hagdolos asher ro einecha, etc. V'lo nosan Hashem lochem leiv lodas ve'inayim liris v'oznaim lishmoy at hayom hazeh. Says Rashi, what does it mean at hayom hazeh? Shamaiti she'oisa hayom she'nosan Moshe sefer Torah l'bnei Levi. Says Rashi, I heard, that this was the day where a Sefer Torah, Moshe Rabbeinu gave a Sefer Torah to his Shevet, to Shevet Levi. So what happened? Bo'u, says Rashi, Bo'u kol Yisrael lifnei Moshe, all of the Jewish people, the other Shvatim came to Moshe, v'amru loi, Moshe Rabbeinu, af onu omatnu b'Sinai, we also stood at Har Sinai, v'kibalnu es ha-Torah v'nosna lanu, we also received the Torah. Why are you giving this Sefer Torah to your tribe, that they have some sort of benefit, advantage, control over Torah? And they'll say to us, one day down the generations, maybe they'll say that the Torah was given to us, Shevet Levi, it wasn't given to you. When Moshe heard the complaint of the other Shvatim, that why did you give a Sefer Torah to Shevet Levi and not to us? Maybe this is what they'll say in the future. We also want a Torah. Moshe Rabbeinu rejoiced. Oh, today you've become a people. Once you've shown your desire for Torah, that you desire a closeness with HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Okay, Ad Kan the Rashi. Says Rabbi Bender, an interesting question I never thought of. You contrast this with another complaint, i.e., Korach. The Pasuk says, "Vayishma Moshe vayiplel ponov." When Moshe Rabbeinu heard Korach's complaint, he fell on his face. Vayidabel Korach v'lakados lema boikev v'yoda Hashem. Tomorrow, in the morning, we will know that who Hashem has chosen, etc., etc. Says Rashi, what does he mean boiker? Says Rashi, umidrasha boiker, omeloi Moshe gevulos cholak HaKadosh Baruch Hu ba'ilomai. HaKadosh Baruch Hu has set boundaries in his world. Do you think that you can make morning into evening? Are you going to say that Moshe Rabbeinu's leadership and Aaron's leadership is wrong? There are borders, there are parameters in the world. Because it says, so just like there's morning, there's evening, there's a system in the world, everyone has roles, everyone has boundaries. Well, so too in this people called Klal Yisrael, here are the leaders, everyone has... Why is it the response of Moshe Rabbeinu is so dramatically different to the Shvatim in this week's Parsha and to Korach? Why does Moshe Rabbeinu praise the Shvatim, and why doesn't he give the same response to Korach when he complained that leadership wasn't given to him? He should have also been delighted with the rotzen of Korach that he wanted it. So Rabbi Bender quotes Reb Chatzkel Levenstein, the famous Mashgiach of the Mir and then later of Ponovich, he says the following. There is a difference between kina and kina sofrim. Kina is negative, kina sofrim is deemed as positive. Kina means, I'm jealous of you, and I want you to be smaller. Kina sofrim means, I would like to be bigger. That's how Reb Chetzkel Levenstein explains the difference. Moshe Rabbeinu perceived Korach's desire was due to his kina of Moshe and Aaron. That's bad news. And therefore he slapped him down and said, Golker, there are gvulos, ba'olam, etc. But the Shvatim wasn't a kina, it was a kina sofrim. They wanted the same connection as Shevet Levi. So therefore he praised that. There's a difference between the two. It's very important to understand where a complaint is coming from. I'll give you an example. I often say this to my colleagues at work. Sometimes we get, Baruch Hashem, it's a huge student body, and you've got a lot of parents, and naturally they've got issues they want to raise with you, but sometimes they get very passionate, and it's they're quite forceful. So I say to my colleagues, I said, just understand where it's coming from. They're complaining about, or they're asking about their kid, and their kid is everything to them. This is how important their ruchnius is, their kodesh provision. This is everything. Understand where it's coming from. First of all, what's the alternative? They don't complain. They're apathetic. They don't care. That's worse. Understand that it's coming from a good place. Rabbi Bender says, he says sometimes you've got to pinch yourself when we know of schools being full and waiting lists and not everyone getting into the schools and yeshivas and sems and things like that. Of course, it's a tragedy and it's a very difficult situation to deal with. We've got waiting lists came out on every single year group we've got. It's just not physically possible to take all the kids on all the waiting lists. But it says Rabbi Yaakov Bender, sometimes we need to pinch ourselves to the situation. Think back 70 years after the Second World War, where people thinking that Orthodox Judaism is dying, and now a new school opens up, it's suddenly full. So take a step back and just understand that a complaint sometimes can be a very positive thing. When Shevet Levi came and displayed that Rotzen, it's sometimes an amazing thing. Let me read you something that Rabbi Bender says, which I thought was very beautiful. He says the following. He said his father, Rabbi Yaakov Bender's father, was appointed the Menal of Torah V'das during an era where there were many Gedolei Torah on staff, but he was a child of America, capable of understanding American youth, and they wanted someone who could stem the tide of children graduating elementary school and yeshiva and then going to public school. That's what they were fighting with back in the 50s. Now, that was a real threat, and now, as fast as a new Mossad opens, they're out of space, Baruch Hashem. A young man called our yeshiva office, says Reb Bender, and introduced himself to our Menahel, Reb Avram Nussbaum. He attended public school, this young man, and wanted desperately to attend a real yeshiva, but his parents didn't let him. He had pleaded with year after year and they refused. But now there was a softening. Please, this boy said, could we accept him before they changed their minds? He told the Manal he spoke with that he was a good boy and he would work hard. Before we made the decision, we took a moment to rejoice. A kid wanted. Moshe rejoiced because he knew that Rotzim, true desire, is the greatest ingredient in success. If Klal Yisrael, if the Shvatim wanted the Torah, then they would embrace Torah. A very beautiful idea. Everything depends on Rotzon. Moshe Rabbeinu perceived the Rotzon of the Shvatim and saw it in a very positive light. We mentioned before that everything to do, like he says, everything is to do with Rotzon. The Gemara says in Baba Kama Lamed Aleph, Hayman the boy Chassid, if a person wants to be a Chassid, then Lekai Milid Nezikin. Says Rava Ovus and says Va'amri Lo Milid Brachas. Rabbi Leff says, you know what the key word is? You could say if a person wants to be a chassid, he should learn Nezikin. Some say Ovus, some say Brachas. So you should just say that if you learn Nezikin, then you become a chassid. You learn Ovus, you learn Brachas, you become a chassid. No, if you medayik the Gemara, Rabbi Leff notes, the key word is man de boy. A person wants. If a person wants something, then he can achieve it. That's like the Gemara in Bracha, Samach Gimel. Rabbi Shmuel says, "Hareitz she'yischakim yasik b'dinim ominous." She'en lecho miktzor b'Torah yosem mehen she'en k'mayil hanuveh. So you should just say that if you want to become wise, learn mominous. So just anyone who learns dinim ominous will become wise. That's not the only ingredient. The key ingredient is haroitza sheyischakeh. It's all to do with rotzen. If a person desires something, then nothing can stop in his way. So that's really the difference why Moshe Rabbeinu, his response to Shevet Levi and to Korach was very different. Korach was a kinnah. He wanted them to be smaller. He was jealous of Moshe and Aaron. But the Shvatim was a kinnah soifrim, and he wanted the same connection as Shevet Levi. Okay, let's finish off with one last idea. This I saw in Rabbi Rosner's Sefer, quoting Rabbi Yoel Schlesinger. He says a very, very interesting thing. There are two, like I mentioned before, there are two teichachos. The teichacha in Parshas B'chukoisai, at the end of Vayikra, and the teichacha, the stinging admonition, in Parshas Kisavin tomorrow, in this week's Edra. Look, take a look at the ending of both teichachos. In Parshas B'chukoisai, this is paragraph 3, the first box, Va'af gam zois b'yosam be'eretz oivehem, lo ma'astim v'lo ga'altim, l'chaloisam l'hafe brisi ki ani Hashem Elokeichem. I'm not going to destroy you. V'zacharti lohem bris rishonim, concludes the teichacha in B'chukoisai, that I will remember the bris rishonim, asher hotzeisi me'eretz Mitzrayim, le'enei hagoyim v'lios lohem, le'elokim ani Hashem. So there's a very reassuring end to the teichacha in Parshas B'chukoisai, which contrasts with not a particularly reassuring end to the teichacha in this week's Edra, Parshas Kisavai. The last pasuk says, "V'hishivach Hashem Mitzrayim ba'onios," you'll go back to Egypt in boats. "V'smakartim sham la'ivecha," you'll be sold to the enemy, la'avodim, v'leshvachas v'ein kaineh, and then no one who wants to buy you. Full stop. End of teichacha. So there's no sort of reassuring, warm ending to the teichacha that there is in Parshas B'chukoisai. V'zacharti lohem bris rishonim, etc. Says Rabbi Yoel Schlesinger, if you look very carefully at the end of the teichacha in Parshas Kisavai in this week's Edra, you will actually find a reassuring end to some degree. Two possibilities. Number one, if you look at the last box on the page, V'shamaiti mehagon Rabbi Tzala Zolti Zatzal. It says Rabbi Yoel Schlesinger, who was a dayan towards the end of the last century in Yerushalayim. He quotes Rabbi Tzala Zolti, who was the Rabbi of Yerushalayim, Levayas Hadvarim as follows: V'ledvar avochein gam kan tamuna bracha b'siyum teichacha. There is a hidden bracha at the end of the teichacha in this week's Sedra. How so? V'hi v'ein koineh. The pasuk says that you'll be sold into slavery, but there'll be no one to buy you. That is a bracha. Shegam kashet techaptzu lehimoker la'avodim lisboil v'litom bein omus. You want to integrate and to assimilate into the exiled nations. Ve'ein koineh. They are not interested in you assimilating to their circles. V'zeh soid kiyum shel Am Yisrael. And ultimately, that is the secret of the existence of the Jewish people. Ki gam kashet chafetzim hem lisboil bein omus. Even if we want to try and join. So one idea is that Ein Koina means it won't be so easy to be accepted into their rank, and therefore that is a hidden bracha. It stems assimilation. Then he says an alternative pshat. Gam b'matzav shel avdus gufnis, even in a situation of physical enslavement, harihem nisharim b'nei chayrin, a person can remain free. Ubaruhu, it's clear. Shegam elu mibnei Yisrael shenimkar la'avodim v'lishvachas b'gal yishonis. The Jewish people who have been sold into slavery in various exiles over the centuries, hari bebirchas hashacha birchu b'shem u'malchus shelo yasani oved. Amazing. In various exiles, they could be in servitude, and yet with shame u'malchus they make the bracha every morning that we all say shelo yasani oved b'simcha rabba, with great joy. Why? Because even though they may be in physical servitude, they remain free. That is perhaps what they're referring to at the end of the Teichach in this week's Edra, ve'ein koineh. But there's no, it's not it's not chal on the Jewish people, a kinyan of avdus, ela b'chol matzav sheyu b'nei Yisrael tomid yishar b'nei chayrin, they can always remain free. You know, the Rav Oshri, who is the famous author of the Shailos and Shuvos Memakim in the Second World War, he was the Rav in the Kovno ghetto, and he's got the most horrific Shailos that came his way during the war years. And in one of the shilas that came to him, that he tells of the story that he was in a shul, and the chazan was saying brachas, and he was reading Birchas HaShach, and he gets to the bracha of Shelo Yosani Oved, and he stops, and he turns around to everyone. He says, "How can we make this? We're in the Kovno ghetto. We are avodim. How can I, with all honesty, say Shelo Yosani Oved? We're being beaten and starved and killed by the Nazis, and how can I say Shelo Yosani Oved?" So all eyes turned to Rav Oshri, and Rav Oshri said that we say it b'simcha rabbah, because whilst we may be physically enslaved, we are really free. And therefore we're not avodim to the Nazis, because spiritually our minds, our hearts are free. Rabbi Rosner quoted an anecdote with Natan Sharansky. When Natan Sharansky, the famous refusnik, was being sentenced to wherever he was sentenced, to the Gulag for many years, he turned to the judge and he said, "You're sentencing me to prison?" He says, "You're the prisoner, because you are forced to follow instructions of the communist government, and I am actually the one who's free, because I can do the right thing, and I can still serve HaKadosh Baruch Hu, and I'm the one who's free." So therefore, perhaps Ve'ein Koine, the end of this week's Teichacha, is some form of a reassuring, warm ending. Either that we were not, they won't accept us, and therefore assimilation will be more difficult, or we will not consider ourselves slaves to our oppressors. So there we have three ideas. Number one is from Rabbi Bernstein, no cause for shame. The enactment was made that the Kohen should recite the words regardless of whether a person could read or not read, not to shame the person who couldn't read. So why don't you make the same enactment for the person everyone should bring bikurim in straw baskets? Because the idea was that they wanted to emphasize, yes, to spare the shame of those who couldn't read, but to emphasize that not being able to read is worth being ashamed about. Not being wealthy, that's okay. To show us some priorities. Then we had Rabbi Yaakov Bender, the Rashi, the beautiful Rashi in the Parsha, that the Shvatim complained, "Why did you give the Sefer Torah to Shevet Levi?" And he was delighted. Now Hayom Hazen Yesel Am, but with Korach you don't see the same response. Says Rav Bender, because one is kina, one is kina sofrim. Kina is bad news. You want the other person to be smaller. I want to be bigger than Moshe and Aaron. I want them to be smaller. I'm jealous of them. But kina sofrim is that I want to be bigger. And therefore he sees the real desire of the other Shvatim to have the same connection as Shevet Levi. And I think that's the concept of desire is really aspiring to greatness is the key ingredient. And then lastly, Rav Shlomo Schlesinger, a very beautiful idea. How come in Parshas B'chukosa you've got a reassuring end, etc. And yet in this week's Parsha seemingly not? No, perhaps Ein Koine is a reassuring ending. How so? Either because the nations won't accept us and therefore assimilation is more difficult, or we will not consider ourselves slaves to our oppressors. Okay.